اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أعلم من خالد الناس وعلى أشرف الله والهدي إلى أشرف المسلمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So the Shaykh deferred to me a question, but I'm hoping he'll add some things afterward, because I was going to ask him a similar question myself. But in terms of the question of slavery and the involvement of Muslims in the transatlantic slave trade, so first of all, like the Shaykh mentioned in his talk, it is true that in Morocco, one of the dynasties in what is today Morocco in northern Africa, sent a colonial expedition into West Africa, into the Songhai Empire in the 16th century. But the reality is, first off, the way in which many of the people understand the relationship of Islam to slavery is colored by their understanding of the relationship of Christianity to slavery. So, and this is not to be offensive or to say that there aren't people who have embraced Christianity of their own accord, but the reality is most of us African American people who were introduced to Christianity, it was through slavery, colonization. This wasn't the case with Islam. When the Moroccans did this, or when the this group of North African people, this empire did this, the people that they were trying to enslave were already Muslim. So the idea that this is how Islam was introduced to these people, first of all, is complete falsehood. No person who knows the history would say that, I don't think. But it gets sort of lost in translation, right? Like, the Christians came and forced Christianity on black people, and the Muslims came and forced Islam. That's not true. And this is why knowing even the history of somebody like Shaykh Antebellum, is so important, because he was one of those people who was enslaved, and he said, not only am I a Muslim, I'm a scholar. And he turned his jail cell into a university where the scholars in North Africa would go and study from him. And even I read in one of the books, they say when it was time for him to go, people, when finally the Moroccan dynasty finally let him go back to his home in West Africa, when he was getting ready to leave, the people were making dua for him. He said, he was letting the people make dua because the people loved him, not his enslavers, but the other people in the country. And then one person said, may Allah bring you back, or something like this. And he like pulled his hand away and said, I never want to come out. I'm paraphrasing, basically said, I never want to come back to this place. That's not a do it. I'm going to say, I mean to. Secondly, this idea that the Muslims were involved in the slave trade. Slavery was a reality in all of the pre-modern world. So yes, there were Muslims involved in slavery. But when we hear, first of all, when we hear the word slavery, and I think it's important to say, yes, there were Muslims involved in slavery, because we want to be honest about the historical record. But first of all, the slavery that was practiced in these pre-modern subsistence economies is totally different than the slavery that we had in this country. So you might, in fact, in Wolof, one of my professors was explaining in Wolof, the word for slave, right? You have one word for the slave who's from your father's house, from Karbala, your father's house. One word for the slave who's from your mother's house. The same way you have in many languages the word for your cousin or something like this, the son of my mother's brother or something like this. Because the person who we call slave would develop a familial relationship. So much so that if someone were to see your slave from your household wearing clothes that were not like the clothes you wore, this would bring shame to you. This would be dishonorable, because this was a person that you were supposed to feed the same food you ate, clothe the same clothing you wore. And even the slave could own property, the slave could marry, the slave had rights. Sometimes the slave would amass more wealth than their master. So if there was a food crisis in that particular locality, sometimes the master or the owner would lament, like, man, this person, he's our slave, but he has all this money, he's not helping us. Why you don't help us? We hungry, So this isn't to say that it wasn't slavery, because this was, and the Shaykh said something earlier today, it was almost like a way of dealing with a refugee crisis, right? Two communities, two societies go to war. There's a group of people that's taken captive, right? Rather than killing them, you would take these people, and these people would become servants in different households, but within the course of a generation, they would then be absorbed into the society, right? As opposed to what happens in the American context, where slavery becomes racialized, right? And it becomes something that a status that extends throughout your generations, right? So it's a permanent sort of undercast, a racial caste system. So the way slavery functioned in West Africa is completely different. And lastly, even this idea that Muslims were the people who sold Africans, sold their African brothers and sisters into slavery. You had all these African societies, all of them engaged in some form of slavery. What's interesting is that the Muslims, and this is what my understanding from my studies, Brother Bilal Ware said similar things, and I was actually going to ask you, Shaykh, if you've seen a similar, what your interpretation of it is. But the tradition of Muslim scholarship in West Africa in the earlier periods, right, up until about the 16th, 17th century, around the time when you have the Moroccan invasion, it's always nonviolent. People come and they will bring in Islam to their societies, but the way they would give dawah, kind of like the way dawah was given in our tradition, right, as African Americans, right? The Nation of Islam or the Dar al-Islam or different Muslim movements or movements who identify with Islam, they would help the community. They would serve the community. They would create institutions that benefited the community. And because of that, people would come to Islam, right? This was very much the tradition of the Jahanke people, the Jula people, the various Muslim scholars would say, this is how we're going to spread Islam, not doing any type of jihad. Something happens during the context of the transatlantic slave trade where suddenly that changes. Where you have people like Sheikh Umar al-Futi, you have people like Sheikh Nasruddin and with us today, Mauritania before him. You have all of these scholars who start to turn violent in how they're going to establish an Islamic society. And it seems that part of it has to do with the way that the transatlantic slave trade is actually destabilizing society. So it's really a fallacy. Anybody who studies the history can tell you that many of the African leaders in West Africa who fought most fervently, violently, physically against the French and the British, they were the Muslims. So and I'll even go a step further and say that this idea that Muslims were the culprits of the transatlantic slave trade, if you trace its genealogy, the first people to say it are white, sometimes British scholars. The big name that comes to my mind is a man named Bernard Lewis, who's a white scholar who definitely didn't have any love for Islam or black people. And it emerges at a time when this project of African and Asian, Afro-Asian solidarity between colonized people is becoming a reality. And suddenly you have these scholars who are writing on behalf of these Western imperial nations who begin to say, well, let's go into history and find some evidence of, what these Muslims and Arabs were doing, their racism. And it is very real that there's racism and ethnocentrism in that history. But this idea of pointing to that, pulling that out and using that as a way to sort of undermine the idea that Islam can be a part of this project of colonized people, black and brown people coming together, that I would say that actually comes from it's an intentional sort of agenda to disrupt that project of solidarity between peoples. So.
All right. Thank you very much. That's why I wanted Habib to speak. He's right here in your city. So, but the only thing I would add to that, I have not seen any evidence, and I'm not saying it's not out there. I haven't read all the data, looked at all the data and all the research, but I haven't seen any evidence that there's a direct connection between the Arab slave trade and the European slave trade. The Arab slave trade was brutal. I was just, looking at some articles on the slave trade in Iran, right? Brutal. And what they would do in Egypt, in Iran, and some of these other places, they would kidnap Africans from Sudan, from Nubia, Ethiopia, Eritrea. The boys, they would castrate them, make them into eunuchs to wash, the women, the harems, and serve. When I was in Mauritania, I studied a few months in Mauritania, I met Fulani scholars, who told me their side, because I talked to Mauritanian, like Arab Mauritanians, and I talked to black Mauritanians, and they, the black Mauritanians had a different story about how this happened, why this slave in Mauritania. And I heard one of my teachers told me the government freed because in 1985 or something like that, 83, the Mauritanian government freed all the slaves. And this traditional Maliki scholar said the government freed our slaves unjustly. All right? And they were wrong to do that. And because in Islamic law, there's a way that you're free. You know, there's due process and protocol. Anyway, he said the government had no right to do that. And he said those slaves that left and ran away after that, they're sinful. All right? And most of the men left and the women stayed. Right? And I spoke to a Fulani scholar, and he said that some of the slaves in Mauritania, and now they're a servant class. They don't call them slaves per se anymore. You can't do that. It's like the N word here in America, right? You're not supposed to say that. But he said some of them are the descendants of people who were enslaved by the Arabs who came here. See, the Arabs in Mauritania, like Mohammed al-Hajj and all these people, their ancestors were actually under the Mali and the Songhai Empire. When these empires were destabilized by the Europeans and by the Moroccans, they ascended to higher places. These were the students of the Africans. And so he said some of these people started doing slave raids, right? On non-Muslim as well as Muslim Africans. And sometimes they would kidnap our children and take them as slaves, right? So there are horrible, horrible tragedies that have been done by Arab Muslims who were involved in their slave trade. But as far as I know, there was no direct connection. In fact, when I was at the, now this is the last thing I'll say, when I was at the Islamic Heritage Museum in DC, Brother Amir Muhammad, everyone know, everyone should go there. You know, it's an amazing place for Islamic history of America. He has a quote, and I don't remember the president it was written to. Maybe it was Abraham Lincoln or president before him. But this Tunisian ruler was telling this American president, he was lambasting him in this letter very eloquently for having American slaves. And he basically said, God has blessed you, and with a great country, he's given you freedom and the Constitution, and to show your thankfulness to God, you should free all of the Africans, in the United States of America. So this was from a Tunisian Arab ruler. Yes.
Shaykh Rasul. Shaykh Ahmed Baba is well known for his treatise, his fatwa against enslaving Muslims. This is one of the reasons why he was enslaved while in prison. Can you explain a little bit? It was ignored by and large.
So what's your question?
I wanted you to explain a little more about his fatwa on enslaving Muslims.
Right. So he has a fatwa. I forget the title. Forgive me. Where he basically establishes that it's not, and this is kind of for us, especially for 21st century modern people. We're like, well, what do you mean? Is it okay to enslave non-Muslims, right? But his fatwa uses verses from the Quran, from the Hadith. He's quoting from books of Maliki fiqh, like Al-Mi'yar of Imam Al-Wanshirisi from Andalusia, establishing that it's not permissible to enslave Muslims, and that's what was happening. Free Muslims were being enslaved and sold, overseas, to the Atlantic. And so the scholars like him, and there were other scholars too who put this out, but there were others, like you're saying, there were our brothers, unfortunately, a lot of Arab Muslims, some Turkish Muslims who ignored these fatwa, and their scholars gave the other fatwa, and they basically didn't see the Africans as real Muslims, right? And just like you have here in the United States, you go into some gas stations that are owned by Muslims, right? The guy's selling, alcohol, selling Philly blunts and selling other things, right? And You got your kufi on, right? You have your beard. Your wife has her kimar, and he asks you if you're Muslim, and you give them you say assalamu alaikum, and they don't respond, right? Because it has nothing to do with what you're saying or what you're wearing. It's Islam for them is an ethnic identity. Yeah, and so so some of these other scholars believed it was permissible, and their rulers took those fatwa and they ran with it. Yeah, and so I think we have to be honest about what happened, and so that we can correct it and it doesn't happen, inshallah. Okay, but like Rasul was saying, the nature of slavery, even amongst the Arabs, was nothing like the chattel slavery in America. Yes, they castrated men and boys. Yes, they kidnapped people. But even after all that horror, and if you look at the pictures and you look at some of the accounts, there was still some dignity. There were some rights that they had. America they broke your soul. They broke your soul. And they took away your language, your lineage, your identity. They separated mothers from their children, wives from their husbands, and husbands. It was something among those best I don't think had ever been done in the history of humanity.
Madness.
Yeah. So.
Great madness.
Really quickly to add something to that. So another thing, there's one indirect connection that I would say that there was between the transatlantic slave trade and the slave trade in the Arab world, and that's this. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, you had Arabs who would enslave Africans. You would also have Africans who owned Turkish slaves, Arab slaves. We know about this when we read about Timbucktu, we read about this history. You also had, actually the majority of slaves, most historians would agree, and I'm not an expert on this particular aspect of the subject, but many historians would say most slaves in the Middle East were actually white. The word Slav even coming from Slavic people, or slave coming from Slavic people. But when the transatlantic slave trade comes about, and these Western nations begin to issue laws that only black people can be enslaved, that affects slavery in the Arab world. Where basically these white nations are saying, no, you're not enslaving people who look like us. As this concept of race is emerging, this concept of whiteness is emerging, you're not having that. You're not enslaving people that we would say are white.
They would only buy black slaves.
Right. And so then at that point, during the transatlantic slave trade, that's when throughout the Middle East, right, throughout the Arab world, slave becomes synonymous with black. And black people are the people who are enslaved. Whereas before that, you could be a black person and own an Arab slave, Turkish slave. It wasn't racialized in the same way. So the transatlantic slave trade and the bringing about of a regime of white supremacy globally as a result of the transatlantic slave trade is part of what creates the racialization of the slave trade in the Arab world. And last thing I'll say, Brother Bilal Ware in his book, I believe he talks about one of the famous rulers of one of the West African Muslim societies. His name is Al-Mami Qadr Khan. I believe he talks about this in the book. He actually abolishes the slave trade in his locality, in the Muslim society that he governs, before the British abolished slavery. So the historical record has generally said, the British came and abolished the slave trade, but we actually have evidence now that no, there were West African Muslim, at least one West African Muslim ruler, and probably others, who said this thing has gotten so out of hand, even though that there's a form of slavery that is allowed in the books of fiqh and our tradition, we just abolishing it altogether because there's no kind of slavery in this context that we can support in our society.
It's interesting that in America, if you were a Moor, you were freed, right? That's why so many Muslims, because back then, if you were a Turk or Moor, like you were talking about Turks earlier, if you were a Turk or Moor,
They had a treaty, right?
they had treaties. And so what you're saying makes me wonder if there was a deal, that we don't slave Europeans, we don't enslave Muslims. So a lot of the Africans, even though they were not ethnically quote unquote Moors, they were Fula or Wolof or whatever, they would call themselves Moors. right? Because they're Muslim, and the Europeans here didn't know the difference, right? Because you're Muslim, you speak Arabic, read Quran, you're a Moor, you're a Turk, and so a lot of them got their freedom that way. So it's interesting that the Europeans here, even in Americans during the times of slavery here, chattel slavery, they would readily free Muslims, and then the Arabs and the Turks, stopped enslaving Europeans. It's interesting.